Otto Weininger was a Kantian. This means that he was essentially an idealist. He was also a Christian who conceived an account of man's fall from grace. His ideas explained the mechanics of man's fall and subsequent sexualization. After man's spiritual fragmentation and loss of spirit came his encounter with the female in all her forms. For Weininger, the genders are in a perpetual state of spiritual warfare, and it is imperative that man comes out on top in the conflict. The only alternative is absolute ruin. First comes the destruction of authentic masculinity as it exists in men and women, masculinity that ultimately strives to reunite with spirit. And then comes the destruction of spirit itself, which Weininger believed was embodied in man alone. In this regard, Weininger's teachings correspond closely with those of the English mystic poet William Blake. For Weininger and Blake, women are the ultimate source of all human pathology. Male violence and crime are but visible symptoms of a malignancy far more elusive and sinister. This metaphysical fact about active masculinity versus passive femininity goes unrecognized because on the stereotypical level, that is, on the domestic and social theaters created by men, women appear animated and hyper-extrovert. This gives the impression that women are self-motivated, willful beings. This is, however, merely an optical illusion. Understanding this predicament demands that we transcend simplistic attitudes. It is not a case of women being inferior to men. Women, within reason, are capable of achieving great spiritual and intellectual heights. However, Weininger's point is that these aspirations are due to the infusion and urge of animus, or masculine will. This will animates women as long as she inhabits a world established by masculinized men. A sane civilization governed by feminized women isn't conceivable or possible, and ones dominated by women easily come to ruin. So it was with the ancient Hittite Empire, which collapsed the moment it was ruled by scheming, sorcery-obsessed queens. And so it will be with Western civilization, unless we revision the role of the female will and female psyche along the lines suggested by Weininger and Blake. For Weininger, a woman's entire raison d'etre is the will of man, as it directs her being. Indeed, he maintains that all aspects of femininity, including a woman's sexual persona, are derivative of animus or male masculine will. A woman becomes a willful, rational being only through her encounter with men in the male world. By embodying masculine dispositions, she gives meaning to her existence, a spiritual meaning and direction otherwise completely absent from her psyche. This is why concepts of female emancipation, superiority, or independence are to Weininger merely irrational myths. The willfulness in a female towards independence is invariably a masculine will, embodied due to the presence and influence of men. In other words, a woman's defensiveness against the male world is an attribute of the very thing she mistakenly wishes to negate and ruin. If such a perverse will is acted upon by a woman, alone or in concert with other misguided women, destruction and insanity will be the only outcomes. Such women wish to castrate that which they secretly covet, and from which all life emanates. This is a difficult concept for most people to embrace, especially for inmates of today's feminized world. However, Weininger is quick to explain. The life a woman experiences is due, he says, to the investment of animus, as it manifests personally, domestically, and socially. Women, in turn, embodies and reflects man's vital will, allowing it to define itself and intensify. According to Weininger, this passive, specular quality of woman is their main virtue. However, in worst-case scenarios, this quality becomes the cause of an attraction versus repulsion dynamic in women, more conspicuous and pronounced when she's in the presence of genius types. As a result of her role as reflector, a woman can choose to subvert the reciprocal transference process, thereby causing the male will to be misdirected or completely undermined. Weininger has a great deal to say about this dynamic and the subversion of male will. The retraction of the male will, he explains, ultimately leads to the voiding of meaning for women as well as for their victims. In a sense, the failure of women in regards to their sovereign duty toward men incurs a second fall from grace. As decades pass, Weininger's words become increasingly prophetic. His vision gets to the heart of why a state of decay exists throughout the world, and why dysfunction exists within the hearts and minds of men and women who, ironically, enjoy greater material affluence than ever. His perceptive analysis of gender dynamics serves as a mirror in which both sexes can see themselves lucidly. By facing the truth about their differences and similarities, the age-old rivalry and long cycle of forgetfulness, conflict, and destructiveness can finally be brought to an end. The subject on which Otto Weininger focused his penetrating intellect was womankind. He was profoundly interested in the psychology and behavior of women. In 1903, he published a definitive work on this little explored and understood subject, entitled Sex and Character. This book ranks amongst the greatest of the 20th century, standing beside the works of Stirner, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Evola, Freud, Jung, Rank, Reich, and other groundbreaking savants and critics. In many ways, Weininger's inquiry into the female psyche is more uncompromising, adept, and revealing than those of his better-known contemporaries. Indeed, the fact that Weininger's work is largely unknown today confirms its exceptional importance and brilliance. It goes without saying that from time immemorial, studies of this kind have been deemed taboo and controversial. In this regard, for all our advancement, little has changed. The subject of women and their criminal history is as politically incorrect as ever. It is as politically incorrect as one can get. So much so that we might question why anyone would be brazen and foolhardy enough to broach this perplexing subject. How far will he get? Who will listen to his wisdom? Will he not be pilloried and ostracized? Are we not locked down in a patently feminized world? Are most men not emasculated and docile in the face of their better halves? Let us not downplay and underestimate the violence of reaction against men who confront the question of what lies behind the mask of most females. To dissent from the accepted notions that little girls are made of sugar and spice and all that's nice is to face reprisals of daunting magnitude. We need only remember the violent backlashes endured by the female authors Esther Villar, Camille Paglia, and Phyllis Chesler, after writing works that delved honestly into the reasons for women's superficiality, narcissism, amorality, duplicity, and cruelty. However, it is not correct to think of Weininger as a supreme misogynist and neurotic crank. That puts him in a ridiculous light and does no justice whatsoever to his intellectual project and invaluable contribution to humankind. 1903 is an important date, given that it was merely 3 years after the turn of the millennium, the famous and traumatic fin de siècle. Weininger stood on the lineman between two ages, different in so many ways. And the greatest difference throughout the years to come for Weininger was to be the practical fates of men and women. From 1903 until the end of the 20th century, what has been the fate of women in contradistinction to men? For the most part, has it not been the difference between recreation and carnage, satiation and toil, frivolity and perplexity, entitlement and servility, excess and enslavement? It is a demonstrable fact that modern women in the West have the boon of living in a domestic bubble, with all their basic needs provided for. They are therefore able and willing to play and to have fun from their earliest years to late in life. For most Western females, life is a breeze, and city life an incubated cocoon free from physical and emotional hardship. Paradoxically, as beneficiaries of this relative comfort zone, women quickly turn decadent, entitled, and resentful. Many turn into caustic critics of the men who labor to build and maintain their world of privilege and plenty. Yes, for most Western women, the city and the world lie at their feet. But the cushions, fashion accessories, and glasses of champagne have been delivered at great cost. Sadly, according to Weininger, that cost does not interest most women. As long as the meat is on the table and the lights continue to burn, all is well. One need not inquire further into the sacrifices and measure of toil expended to produce it, nor need one be concerned about the consequences of idleness, affluence, and unearned entitlement. Importantly, how do most Western mothers describe men to their impressionable daughters? Are young girls taught to admire men or to envy, despise, and exploit them? Do women today willingly work alongside men as equals, or attempt to outgun and humiliate them? Crucially, what do men really know about the psychology of women? How would we rate their insights? Is it high or low on the scale? What do men know about women of the past? Do they blithely ascribe all crime, violence, cruelty, and injustice perpetrated through the millennia to their own sex? And is it correct to do so? And what of the future, near and far? If envy, contempt, and competitiveness are to be the order of the day, endorsed by an irrational, feminized society, what will happen to the civilization built by men? What will come of all the sweat, tears, losses, and spilled blood? What if tomorrow's young men, non-consciously, change themselves into docile bodies, directed in every way by amoral women in their circles? Seeing that women in the West feel entitled to luxuries they have not earned, and seeing that most women around them live in a pink bubble of comfort and plenty, might not young men be inclined to feminize and infantilize themselves to experience the same idle lifestyle? Might not their morality also be contrived and superficial? After all, as Weininger knew, women's morality is for the most part of an artificial variety. Most women become moral not because of true rational ego ideals, but because it affords them the approval and comforts they require. This predicament starts young. At home and at school, most women are not severely penalized for their disobedience, petulance, and misdemeanors. They are praised for being good and not overly punished for not being good. Boys, on the other hand, often find themselves punished for delinquent behavior, but never praised for good behavior. In many cases, girls are generously praised and endowed for only slight acts of goodness, while boys must win their prize of approval with more unnecessary effort. Today, it is not uncommon to see feminized metrosexual or transsexual men entering into just this contract. They have decided, consciously or unconsciously, to identify with the ways of acculturated, entitled women. This is not due to any genetic tendency, but to social conditioning. Everyone wants to enjoy pleasure and avoid pain. Men have been well taught by their mothers and societies how to guarantee present and future comfort. As our societies become increasingly immoral, hedonistic, and promiscuous, we will surely see the end of authentic masculinity. It is daily being compromised and redefined by the social engineers, exultant at the feminization occurring on the streets. It's a wet dream for establishment boss hogs. Docile bodies in plenty, complicity and conformity from all quarters. Hallelujah. So much for our one-click drive-through culture. It's an atrocious state of decay, and few are the sane solutions for it. As Weininger shows, most male crime is, despite its variegation, often due entirely to evil perpetrated on men by women. Of course, this violence is often not of an explicit nature. It tends to be emotional and sexual. It is subtle and less detectable. It is certainly not prosecuted by law. In extreme cases, it can continue at high intensity for decades, leaving one victimized and hostile. The more women discover that there is nothing except male aggression, abating their sadism towards male victims, the more they are inclined to maneuver themselves into positions where they can gratuitously indulge their sadistic urges, especially on those unable or unwilling to defend themselves. In numerous cases, it is a mother's psychically incestuous seductive relationship with a growing male child that accounts for the latter's delinquency in later life. It is due to the immoral treatment at the hands of their neurotic mothers, from the womb onward through the Oedipus phases and beyond, that compels some men to act violently toward others. One cannot count the amount of men lying in the prisons of the world who, after mentally tracing the steps that led them to their sorry predicament, suddenly see in a flash what motivated their outbursts, irrationality, and crimes. Time after time, to hide past profligacy, mothers scandalously choose to conceal a child's true paternity, heedless of the considerable subconscious anxiety and rage churning within the deceived. One cannot account for the number of neurotic, psychotic, and full-blown schizophrenic children driven to despair and violence by cold, indifferent, or sadistic mothers. Statistics and official data leave us in no doubt about the causes of such pathology. Is it not time for us to accept that all men are brought into this world by women, and that they are frequently chronically abused and disaffected by mothers, sisters, lovers, and wives? Do we lose by listening to sages who expertly inform us how deep this influence goes? This sinister predicament holds for historical crime also. The number one reason for crime in early societies was prostitution. In order to procure pleasures from the papillons de nuit, the butterflies of the night, men often began perpetrating many well-known felonies, such as pickpocketing, pilfering, mugging, extortion, embezzlement, forgery, etc. The reason why adult men need paid sex is very often due to their mother's suppression of their sexuality when young. A mother's disapproval toward a son's natural interest in the female body, or her humiliating words about his body and appeal to women, causes unnatural tendencies and abnormal curiosity, not to mention revulsion. A mother's inappropriate seductiveness and exhibitionism, deliberately sauntering in underwear or in the nude, not only embarrasses but arouses perverse urges. As a boy grows, his interest in sexuality can become depraved. Decent ideas about sexuality have been perverted, causing revulsion and morbid fascination. To discover why female sexuality has a mysterious power over him, a growing boy is often compelled to seek out women with whom he can, as it were, experiment. Unfortunately, such attempts to penetrate the contrived mystique of women can lead to profound self-criticism, defensiveness, resentment, and hostility. One is likely to be caught in a vicious cycle of attraction versus repulsion, leading to addiction, obsession, crime, and complete meltdown. Since sex is a basic requirement, it is not surprising to find sexually repressed, morbidly curious men driven into the hands of licentious women who expertly exploit their hang-ups and basic needs for pleasure and release. Little has changed throughout the generations. Prostitution is now pandemic in the cities of the West. What is more, today's liberated women loudly celebrate the rights of prostitutes and lap dancers. Hardly a word is spoken against this degeneracy by most women, and no female group dare call for prostitution's complete cessation. This is because men who indulge their desires with prostitutes and who frequent strip clubs feel guilty for doing so. This condition makes them feel furtive, sullied, and morally inferior to the decent women, quote-unquote, around them. This in turn serves sanctimonious women well, providing them with one more scourge against men. We see how the industry of corrupt women aids and abets the cause of feminized women in their campaign to humiliate men for their natural desires and urges. This does not exonerate men from blame, but does extend the finger of responsibility to women whose own immorality compels illegal and immoral acts of this sort. This does not include mention of the endless personal and domestic brawls, duels, and feuds instigated on the behalf of some woman's honor. Of course, there are masculinized women in the world who admire and respect men. Their sense of morality isn't contrived and flimsy. They do work hard and don't expect goodies without earning them. They do not bring up their daughters to see their fathers as insensitive buffoons to be ridiculed and humiliated. They praise their daughters for good acts and rationally punish them for immoral actions. They do not encourage them to sit back, to be lifted and laid by a politically correct nanny state. They teach them to speak up when it's right to do so and to be honest and forthright at all times. These young women learn to respect their bodies, beauty, and sexuality. They know their beauty and sexuality is never to be used to manipulate and degrade men under any circumstances. It is there to inspire men to attain higher states of pleasure, morality, creativity, understanding, and wisdom. It is a value worthy of respect, rather than one to be exploited for narcissistic ends. Mothers of this sort do not permit their sons to lose all sense of manhood. They do not allow them to become feminized, infantile, and neurotically withdrawn. They nurture boys who develop a healthy sense of values and a strong sense of self-esteem. They teach their sons that their duty is to leave the planet in a better condition than when they found it, and that in committing to this work, they honor the legacy left to them by great minds of the past. Tragically, most mothers are not bothered with this responsibility. Conscientious women are becoming rarer by the day. The loss of positive male role models and of embodied masculinity causes fallout for both sexes. It will eventually bring ruin to Western civilization. The evidence warning of this predicament is in plain sight all around us. The good news is that regardless of how massive, egregious, and forbidding, there is no problem plaguing our world that can't be solved. This is because we have at all times the greatest archive of wisdom at our disposal, the past. We have the great minds of the past, who because of their formidable genius understood what was to come and what their descendants were likely to encounter. Weininger was one of these geniuses, and his insights enable us to remedy the gender-related controversies overwhelming us today. And remedies are indeed vitally needed. From the time of Mary Wollstonecraft and the suffragettes, women have howled for rights and reforms. Consequently, they received these in plenty. But let's observe our society and ask whether women have really labored to make life better for all. Are wars a thing of the past? Is crime? Has animal cruelty subsided? And do animals have rights? Are people more conscientious about the state of the natural world? Has corporate filching ceased? Has the food industry become more humane and healthy? Has the welfare of children improved under their guidance? Are there less mentally disturbed and homeless people in the land? Has poverty been obliterated? Has the education of children been upgraded? Are jobs any more secure than in ages past? Does every man and woman receive a fair trial? Are people more content with their lot? Has drug abuse abated? Have suicide and depression rates decreased? Have divorce rates decreased or increased? Do most married men experience nurturing, loving relationships? Do children experience more love and security in the home? It's not rocket science. Obviously, women's liberation and inclusion in politics and government has not abated the quota of want and evil anywhere in the world. Indeed, it might well have increased it. If this is the case, it remains for intelligent, unbiased people to inquire into why things are this way. What are the underlying reasons for man's violence and destructiveness? Does it all happen because of testosterone? After all, women make up half of the population of the world. They also command about 80% of the finances spent in the commercial outlets of the world. We must not, however, wait for women to broach the questions we delve into here. Most women are not predisposed to acknowledge the criminal history of their sex. Indeed, women are far more inclined to rationalize their immoral acts. There are always mitigating circumstances and scapegoats to blame for their deviance and delinquency. There is always the chorus of fellow women to shout down and explain away evidence of female degeneracy. Women ardently play the blame game and have done so for decades. There is no reason for them to put an end to any of it or turn within. If evil exists in the world, it is simply down to men. That is the one-size-fits-all comeback. What further explanation is required? Of course, these platitudes fly in the face of women who queue up in their thousands to correspond with, date, and marry with the world's worst serial killers, mobsters, thugs, and bad boys. The heinous violence of these deviants doesn't seem to bother their obsessed, self-righteous groupies and malls. It flies in the face of the thousands of women throughout America, members of temperance leagues, who during the early 20th century repeatedly petitioned the government for sin taxes and finally for prohibition via the 18th Amendment of the Constitution and the Volstead Act. Their relentlessly loud, sanctimonious virtue signaling and disregard for the consequences of their irrational actions allowed the mafia to rise to power in almost every city of America, and for thousands of innocent people to lose their lives and livelihoods from the sale of poisonous liquor, bootlegging, crime waves, and job losses that followed the nationwide ban on the legal sale of alcohol. The responsibility for every casualty of the 13-year period and all the poverty and suffering that swept the nation in those years is traceable to irrational women, none of whom accepted responsibility for their actions or suffered prosecution or punishment. Most of these wealthy Fabian socialist reformers died peacefully in their luxury homes and apartments. Empirical evidence of this kind shows us that denial, rationalization, and indifference will not benefit the world. It is infantile and plainly erroneous. It is time, therefore, for sensible, mature men and women to inquire, as Otto Weininger did, into their sexuality, character, and psychology. What we discover might not be pretty and might drastically alter the status quo. Healing deep wounds always involves a level of pain. It also requires patience and temperance. Our healing certainly involves the cultivation of a deeper respect and reverence for the archive of the past, the well from which all who spiritually thirst can turn for insight and wisdom. After imbibing deeply of the gnosis contained within his brave works, let us proudly add Otto Weininger's name to the list of sages and savants on whose shoulders we stand. It is not that we must prove Weininger right when it comes to the underlying nature of women. Even a brief study of the female will shows that he was essentially correct in his observations. Our attention must primarily be concerned with the uncanny accuracy of his critiques. And what a grandstand view we have today to prove him right, should we need to. The women throughout the Western world have, of late, willfully cast off their masks, their true natures standing revealed in the full light of day. Had Weininger lived to see our degenerate world, he would not have been shocked and surprised at the antics and disposition of womankind. Only at the time it has taken men to gain the wisdom he bravely imparted on this most obscure and profound matter, the female psyche.